colleagues and academics that are here. This is the first Artist Forum of the year. My name is Itumeleng Walihulere. I convene and with colleagues here the Artist Forum, Humanities and Sessions Artist Forum for the year. And the first one is done by Themba Tsotsi. Obviously, Primesh is here to moderate the thing for Themba. And just a little intro on Themba. This session focuses on Tsotsi's book that he has written on art movements and the discourse of acknowledgement and distinctions that examines migrant labor. Therefore, Tsotsi has worked mainly as an artist and as a critique with Gugulective a couple of years ago. And therefore, as an artist that works with a lot of artists that have traveled globally and in Europe, he has been working mainly with artists around Gugulective and Cape Town. Therefore, we'll focus on his art and his book. And that's it. Thank you, Primesh. Let's welcome Themba Tsotsi, who's joining us today. Thank you very much.
And I want to start with a little bit of an anecdote. So in 2003, a young man by the name of Themba Tsotsi entered my first year class. And when I asked him for his name, and he said, you know, his last name was Tsotsi, I asked him if he was related to Wycliffe Tsotsi. And those of you who are historians of the Eastern Cape will know the legendary Wycliffe Tsotsi, once a member of the Unity movement, a great legal mind. I was thinking today that actually in that lineage of legal minds, Madlanga might have even been part of that inheritance. So great legal thinkers who tested the limits and possibilities of what it might mean to both trick apartheid's kind of rationality, but also to exit its constraints. So it was great to have Themba Tsotsi in a class in first year. He was rebellious, as most people are when they are young. But he was also one of a group of very important students who delved into the first year of the study of the story of the return of Hinsa's skull and the question of Nicholas Xaleka. So it's really great because, you know, to have you here. After many years, we have crossed paths, sometimes at the Gugulective, sometimes at a gig, sometimes having a beer. But wonderful to have you in a setting to talk about this project that you've produced for us as a gift. And I want to say that, you know, it took me by surprise because I kept asking colleagues, including Kemang, Walehulere, and a whole number of others, where is Themba Tsotsi? So in my imagination, the way they described it was that you were in the United States of America. And that's why where you were holding forth. And so I had this imagination that you were, you know, had become one of those superstars in the US Academy, not realizing that you were working away on this book in the environments of Cape Town. So it's great to see that we could connect again and invite you to this first Artist Forum. I want to just say very briefly that to give you some context of what we're trying to do in the kind of longer imagination of these artist forums and all the other work around aesthetics and aesthetic education that we engaged with in the center. I mean, part of it is to think about what it might be to constitute the foundations and building blocks of a discourse at UWC in the arts, in a space where an arts education was prohibited. And you might remember that our forays into the story of the killing of Hinsa was sometimes tracked through the kind of image formations of George Pemba and a whole number of others. So there's an important way in which what we are, what we doing with these conversations is also setting to work on the foundations of a new model of arts education that will hold together the promise that we first discovered in the Community Arts Project collection that we inherited at UWC several years ago, and that, you know, Itumeleng and Heidi and a number of others have been very, very engaged with putting into a conversation in the academic spaces of the university. So all of that to say, we're hoping that in this conversation, we could take you through some of the stages of the building of your own discourse. And I want to postpone that conversation on the book a little by asking you to first reflect a little bit about, you know, where are the kind of starting points, the beginnings of this book. And I say that, I use that word beginnings because, you know, in a wonderful meditative essay by Edward Said, which became his first book called Beginnings, he talks about how beginnings are always multiple, and so sometimes, we never actually consciously know where things begin, but it is an opportunity to reflect on where are the many beginnings of Themba Tsotsi's journey into this book.
First of all, I'd like to thank you, Pramesh, and the center for this opportunity. It's really been a long time coming for me because I've been thinking about this work and this idea intensely, like past 10 years or so. And in terms of where this idea began or was birthed, uh, it really did actually start at UWC, studying English and history. I majored in English and history.
First history, then English.
Actually, first English, and then
Rebellious.
and then history. And my thinking really became structured there because I started thinking about how to like sort of navigate my way in a kind of formal westernized institution, and thinking about the history that I'm learning in terms of pre-colonial history and the colonial history, and how those two aspects, in a way, there's a narrative of division between them. Uh, like with pre-colonial history that I was doing, it was always kind of the conversation of like the end of the pre-colonial era here in South Africa in particular. Uh, how the colonizers colonized Xhosa people and the rest of South Africa, and how like remember the story of Ngqawuse in particular. And then in with history, like contemporary history, it was called contemporary history. We were studying like basically like occupation, like the implications of it, because I remember there were emphasis on the concepts around the literature around like colonization, and how like the colonization affected like African communities, like using violence, and how that violence became a different narrative from from the colonization that was happening in pre-colonial context. So this idea of kind of the contradiction, it really started there, like things that uh, informed by the same metaphoric structure, but in practice, they are practiced as if they are divided. Because like pre-colonial colonization is the same as contemporary colonization or colonization that happens like in urban context. And then I had an opportunity to travel. I did a like an exchange program at in the US. Yeah, yeah. But
I was following you around.
it was in
On
'05.
Facebook, you see.
That was before Facebook, wasn't it? Before Facebook? Oh, you just had your own personal one.
Even historians lie.
Yeah. And then there, uh, what was important for me is that I got introduced to primary texts, like Marx, a woman named Smedley, who kind of opened my mind into thinking about how different colonizations, not just here in Africa, happened, but in Europe, in North America, and how also the kind of project that she was proposing is that those narratives are also connected, but they are purported as if they emanate from like from different perspectives. In that book, I learned that the word Caucasian is actually a tribe of people from Russia. It's just that the scientists in the 19th century used those people as like a prime example of what represents a Western Protestant Catholic identity. So see, also, and then I got to thinking, oh, also within European colonization, there are contradictions and divisions that what that are only practical in context, and but they still pay homage to a collective, metaphoric ideology. And then in '06, yeah, Zivo,
Before we get
nice
to
to see
the
you.
Gugulective, I want to just if we could just hold on to some of that, because there's a crucial way in which that shift in the curriculum in the 2000s at UWC, which was opening all sorts of questions about the entanglements and bifurcations and inadequate reckonings with apartheid and its aftermath. So in 2003, there'd been enough leg room, between 94 and the kind of post-apartheid to begin thinking about what's at stake in this thing, and where are its coordinates, and everything seemed to be more complicated than we imagined 10 years before. And just so you know, a precursor to in the discourse of history at UWC is that the first course that was taught, and Leslie Witz, who is, we're going to be celebrating in a few weeks' time, was the main proponent of this curriculum called Debates in the Making of the Atlantic World. And that course took as its it took its cue from Eric Hull's Europe and the People Without History. It basically begins in a moment when the entire world is marked by tributary modes of production, different forms of it, different relations of ideology within it, and so on and so forth. And in each of those, Leslie was able to show what a global interconnectedness came to look like. In other words, when the world enters a kind of moment of trade and colonization and so on, how did those tributary societies shift? What shifted within them? So when we get to the 2000s, there's an increasing anxiety about how we're going to deal with these questions in South Africa. So in that moment, there is a worry that the entire cultural milieu is being reduced to an inconsequential and epiphenomenal question of the South African transition. So it's given the status of ornament. And, the people who fight really hard to kind of put this together again as it is being disassembled under neoliberal dispersal. And I think that what happens increasingly is this peripheral movement of the arts that hold on to something like an aesthetic tradition that would, without which apartheid would never have been defeated, let alone contested. And I found a lot of that energy in the work that the Gugulective had undertaken. So there was something brewing, as Steve Biko puts it, on the edges of a society in decay that was beginning to take hold in that moment. So I want to, I know there's we've just buried Roland Wabo a few weeks ago at the memorial, and there were all these colleagues who came out of CAP, but then also entered into conversation with Gugulective. We had Kemang here a few weeks ago talking about his relation, or the relation of his artistic practice to the experience of the Gugulective. I want to ask you firstly, before you tell us about the big story about the Gugulective, what's your story of the Gugulective?
Okay, my story of the Gugulective is like a generation that that understood actually that the visual is has a very didactic role that plays in how we are perceived, especially where we come from. And so instead of fighting that, we wanted to make a connection. And in a way, or in kind of intermittent and like in kind of incrementally, hopefully, as we were hoping to to make a long term like a conversation between the township and the CBD, or what in discourse is called like the center. And in doing that, we were trying to dismantle the narrative that people from the township don't contribute, or they don't have the intellectual capacity to grapple like concepts of emancipation, especially, and yeah, and like having a universal conversation, uh, and and in doing so, we yeah, we did kind of have a rebellious stance, because but then that was inevitable. Yeah, we expected that, and so we were never aggressive in our approach, and even in the artworks that we did, we was political as as in terms of way of making works that show that we are having a universal conversation instead of having a particular township a voice where we are submissive and passive, but actually we're just showing the audience that we are inherently part of a conversation. And uh, yes, our proximity to the city uh, has a disadvantage, places us in a disadvantage. But yeah, we are having a broader, universal, inclusive conversation.
I mean, there's so much of what you're saying that resonates with what we've been thinking about in this space. I mean, so when we first mooted the idea of this project, this building, the proposal we put to the university was that we should call it the Center for the Periphery. And then because the university lost its sense of humor, they said, we're going absolutely mad. They're not going to call it that, right? And they also rejected Great More or Less, which I think was a pretty cool name. But you know, this is such it's a more important point. I mean, I recall doing a book launch of the Hinsa book in Gugulective at the Gugulective, and this woman who walked in and said, she waited for 5 minutes as I was speaking and said, you mustn't listen to anything he's saying. He's talking rubbish, you know, and then she left. But there was an energy there that was like really provocative. And, you know, I'm worried about the way in which the erasure of the intellectual force of the struggle against apartheid that resonated in places on the edges of the cities, in townships and so on, has been completely obliterated. So that these spaces have become spaces of underdevelopment. And the spaces where you go deposit benevolent gestures, you know. And it reminded me, Leslie Witz many years ago did a study of township tours. And what you get is, in the city, you will get history. District 6, slavery, blah, blah, blah. You get all of that. Then by the time you get to the township, you get taken to the Shabin, to the hostel, and
To the butcher, to the butcher.
exactly. And
Shisanyama.
the entire thing is marked by underdevelopment. So there's no history on the periphery. There's nothing happens there other than, you know, these people were recipients of apartheid's violence in some form or the other, and therefore what is required here is a benevolent gesture. So I want to ask about the fate, you know, of Gugulective, because at some point it ends up in Ezekiel at the opening of Pierniv to Gugulective. And I mean, I'm not going to ask you about all the intricate debates, because I know, you know, we as the center hosted a review with Riason Naidu about the rehanging of that gallery and the debates with the friends of the gallery. It was uneven, and it was, you know, you could see the aggression in South African institutions and the protectionism that was in place to guard against anything that would reshape and that would alter these institutions. But tell us a little bit about, you know, those, when you enter the city, what happens to the idea that is flourishing in the Gugulective, in the spaces of Guguletu?
Okay, one of the anchoring ideas behind Gugulective was the notion of space, the idea of space. How people from like the township, we have a limited the how we navigate space is very limiting, and it is limited within the architecture. And then in the city not only represents like a reprieve, but it represents like it becomes your own individual attachment to a bigger narrative. Yeah. I know this work you're talking about, the building in the man, me and Datini and Unati, we kind of laid the foundations for it. That that artwork, it's really actually meant to be provocative because it's taking a household and putting up on a wall, and that idea is also how a painting like evokes ideas, and so in a way a canvas is space, but so is but so is a room, the room is, but then there's the politics of the room. The room is where families are raised, where the privacy and the sanctity of that space becomes an issue. And as someone from the township, like when you're kind of going into town represents a possibility. Like it's not, that's where kind of the controversy of that word comes in, is that you go to town to experience a possibility, and then you go back home, where at home you're gonna literally like go to your bed, like in the same space. The work was inspired by Mampela Rampele's book, A Bad Code Home. And there, there in that book, she talks about how the families who were moved from the Eastern Cape to the Western Cape, who like literally start over their lives. They become severed from like from idea or experience of space that is wide and expansive, which is like a rural Eastern Cape, and then they come here to literally like live in a bed, because like in some families, people sleep under the bed. So like we were grappling with those issues where we felt it was really taking a while for the apartheid government, or the change, sorry, to impact us and affect us. So yeah, we were just okay. Let's start this collective. Kimang was very crucial in anchoring like the foundation of Gugulective, because it's already been an established name practicing, and he was always like talking about how when he's in town, he does little diversity, or there's no representation, or there's little, and we were not in a way consciously trying to fill an intellectual void from the township, because yeah, the artists who are our age, who are practicing, kind of in a way represented that for us already. It's just we needed a platform. It was just need, yeah, that's
I mean, there's a crucial point here about the movement of ideas. So, there's a common denominator here, and it's this man's brother, Opa Walehulere, who is Kemang's uncle. And when I was in Athlone, every Saturday I went to read Marx and Capital with Opa, and then later Dinga, and I learned how to jump a train. Because, I'm a middle class guy, with soft hands. The first time I jumped a train, I almost broke my neck. So then I was taught how to jump a train, because there was the money needed to be used to buy biscuits for the reading group rather than pay for my ticket. But there's a kind of movement of ideas that's quite crucial, because I think that the locus of intellectual formation is really one that has been utterly displaced in the post-apartheid. So I'm thinking about someone like Bransby and Dobe. This man comes from the Eastern Cape, where Govan and others had Gambeki were recruited into the Communist Party. Yes, partly because Eddie Roo and his wife Wim Roo had their honeymoon at the base of Fort Hare University. And, Govan joins the Communist Party as a result of those meetings. But Bransby and Dobe takes a train to Cape Town as a migrant worker, ends up in Worcester. He doesn't have enough money to make the full journey to Cape Town, and then becomes one of the most important intellectuals of that part of the Western Cape. And I was thinking also about Mpendulo, who just passed away now. The man whose kids got killed in that raid in Umtata. I mean, he comes as a migrant worker to Cape Town and then goes to Langa to meet his friend. And there, this man is speaking, and man turns out to be Robert Sobukwe. And he's just impressed with this man's Xhosa. He's like, beautiful phrasings. She's not even interested in the politics. He just talks about the poetics of this language. And so I'm trying to ask, in all of those, that milieu, cultural and otherwise, I've been trying to write about jazz and cinema and in my own fragmented way, but how much of that loss affects the way we think about the kind of intellectual formations of the city. And I want to ask you a question now about the book, the word acknowledgement. Is this a recollection in the title of the book for this history that you're trying to come to terms with? And how have you worked it out in the book? So let's get into the kind of formation of the book.
Well, I mean, I think also your question like harkens to legacy and like because we live in a Western society and it's hyper individualized, certain legacies, like okay, like Steve Biko, for example, they and Sobukwe, their intellectual output is their like their own. It's iconic because it's associated with them. Part of our kind of like post-apartheid struggle was like, how do we co-opt and incorporate that? Uh, and the only way we could do that was just let's make artworks. Let's having conversations about space and like economic access, which are basically like what was also being discussed during the struggle. And this word acknowledgement is to like to have a kind of an acceptance of your circumstance, but then also accept that you're not bound by it. You're not it doesn't define you. It what it does is that it makes you relate to diversity in a way that that pronounces your individuality or the universality of your individuality. Like that's like when I was thinking about this word is first of all it's accessible and that's like it's easy to understand. And so for me, this kind of like a metaphor when I meet someone who looks different from me, which is partly because of my cultural training, my visual training. It is it's just that I'm acknowledging myself, but I'm also acknowledging someone else. Like there's no like I always think about when you don't want someone to speak to you and they don't look like you or speak your language. In order for that person to philosophically understand that, they must be able to speak your language. Yeah, they must understand to understand you. They must understand your language. Yeah. That's yeah.
No, the question of translation is important. I think there's also in what you're saying a way in which acknowledgement is not recognition. So, many years ago, just before David Holwane passed away, they did the retrospective exhibition in the Iziko Gallery. And I happened to be asked to kind of say a few words, very difficult because he was dying, as we know. But Holwane said something fascinating to me at the end of that conversation. He says, I never sought recognition, but I'm terrified of being erased. And this is in the face of death, what Edward Said calls late style, where you say things out of, without the constraints, So I was intrigued by the use of the word acknowledgement, you see, because the thing here is that when you inhabit a space at UWC, and UWC has a lot to learn from just what you said now, the assumption is that you're seeking recognition. But actually, it is acknowledgement that might do more work for the intellectual possibilities that inhere in spaces marked by the legacies of apartheid and the struggle to exit those legacies, those double binds of apartheid. So I was fascinated by that term. But then you have, now your handwriting is as bad as it was in 2003. If it has, either my eyesight has worsened or your handwriting has. But give us that second term in your title of your book.
Okay. The second term, distinctions. Uh, when you acknowledge or you feel that you've been acknowledged, that's there's a kind of a natural reaction of that there's a distinction that's established, and that it's not in my discourse. That's not a point of division. It's not a point of aggression or negativity, and it's a it's just also like it it's a word that kind of connotes also like being acknowledged, and also your term right now, recognition. But what it does, it also understand that there's a whole history of a didactic principle that forces you to be within yourself, to hold yourself back. Uh, so I'm trying to make that a model to to people who read the book to understand that uh, being acknowledged uh, is not necessarily pressure, but there's an operation of an inherent unfolding, especially in social context.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to just, so one last point before we open it up. And I suppose, it is something that I've been trying to tussle with. And I think it's really in the 1920s in this country where you have a working out of the segregationist state, or what the historians call the first iteration of segregation in this country. And that is that you need to figure out two questions for the state at the time. You need to figure out the native question and the poor white question, or what was called the native problem and the poor white question. I mean, it's interesting how problems and questions, given what we've been through this past week with Erich Hurl and the short circuiting of problems and so on and so forth. But you see, what the long and short of it is that what ultimately, in my view, happens is that the native becomes a conglomerate. So you can only answer the problem and the question of the native through ethnicity or race. It's a kind of group identity, if you like. And the psychological premises of that is a kind of weird form of the collective that always inheres in a kind of Bantustanization of consciousness. The poor white, on the other hand, is individualized. And so they're given individuality, and they're given the right of passage to individuation. You can individuate into a collective. So you get a cultural kind of flourish on that side through the kaka and ka and all of these things. What are the other things? Atya, fear, all of these things were modes of creating nuclear family identities and then individuated identities in relation to that. So this word acknowledgement and distinction, the coupling of those terms is a real, for me, marks a struggle of what it might mean to understand inhabiting the kind of problem of apartheid and its aftermath. So tell us then about the core term, the concept. I'm going to struggle to say it, hysteridence.
Yes, yeah.
So I'm all for the invention of seductive concepts, as you know. But, concepts must take us somewhere. It must, work towards something. Tell us what you want to do with this term in the book.
Well, I mean, you just gave an example of how it operates in a society. Okay. Yeah. It's the idea that there are certain values, like universal values, that in low-income communities they function differently, but they in high income communities they function in another way. The example you just made is the perfect example because it it shows how whiteness is constructed, and in how concepts like ethnicity and indigenous are constructed away from whiteness. Like in my book, how I think about it is how how this was achieved was there's the people that formulated the ideologies have a particular ontology that they purported that is universal, is theirs, and there's something divine about it. And white people, whether you're poor, you you fit into that ontology, which goes back to this term Caucasian. Because we come to understand that all white people are Caucasian, but then literature tells us, no, that's not. And then like notions like ethnicity and they function in a different way because they emphasize an absence from those ontologies, from those ontologies that formulated ideology. So in my work, I'm saying that that's an operational and functional uh, aspect of society that has become so practical that even the people that are associated, or that are not, sorry, associated with those, with the ideologies that formulated the structures of society, they they're associated with it, and but it's only through training. There's a acculturation process that happens, and or the kind of irony is that that acculturation is not universal. It just also the poor white and the poor black, they don't have that. And the idea is that they don't have it inherently. They are born without the language, the kind of the ontological space. They need to be inculcated into that a framework that is alien to them, which contradicts where they come from, which contradicts their values and their foundations.
Is that why you're so eager in this book to get to concepts? Is that what's driving the kind of impulse, the sense that you can only individuate through a reckoning of a concept in relation to an artwork? So an artwork on its own won't do the trick.
Well, I mean, the what the concept does is it makes you conscious of the didactic issue. The reason I'm so focused on the concept is that the didactic issue uh, has a history. We can trace where it began. Whereas when they talk about the community, both black and white, they talk about it as if, yes, it did exist, but it didn't have this kind of divisive philosophy. If you follow, yeah, it didn't, and that's true. Yes, we agree. I agree, but then the practically what they have formulated, we must follow, and yeah, this the didactic issue. Yeah.
No, I mean, it's great hearing you say and articulate this this conceptualization of the project, because in many ways I've been wondering, and because we're busy doing this Irish anti-apartheid movement exhibition in Dublin, and going through the archive, I'm wondering, as you traverse this 87 boxes, you get these amazing, incredible collection, until you hit the collection on the art interventions. And suddenly there are all these poets and Samuel Beckett and all of these great thinkers and lyricists, lyrical poets and so on and so forth. And you realize that actually the global anti-apartheid movement was not an economic or political project. In fact, it failed on both of those scores. It was the cultural project that created a different sense of belonging to that struggle. And that struggle was not about being against apartheid. That struggle was about building a post-apartheid world. So the solidarity that was created was this solidarity about a world that did not exist, what Jonathan Culler calls voicing a structure, which is what I think Ukwanda does. They voice a structure because that structure isn't there. It's a loose organization of possibility, right? And in that sense, I think what you're doing is giving us a cue on where we might set to work on what we're calling an aesthetic education. Because again, yeah, there are many beginnings to this question. So I'm extremely grateful for the way you've laid out, the kind of deep thinking that's gone into this inquiry. And I know that it's difficult because the entanglement of where one thinks from, the city and the township, the urban and the periphery, the rural and the urban, these conundrums were constituted through this very notion of apartheid, which by its very resonance gives the notion of apartness as its kind of foundational fiction. So I'm going to pause there and say thank you for, this provocation. I think let's open up for a round of questions so that we don't hog the mics and you get to hear other opinions and views and thoughts and questions. So the floor is open.
Yeah, I start because I guess saxophonists always have to take the first solo. So I'm cursed to do that for the rest of my life. When you were talking about acknowledgements, distinction, etc., and I'm speaking as a jazz scholar, what immediately came to mind was John Coltrane's The Love Supreme, where one of the movements is the beautiful acknowledgements. Bam, ba-ya-ya, bam, ba-ya-ya, ba-dam-dam-dam, bam, ba-da-dam, ba-dam. Yeah? And that acknowledgement has to do, as you said, with, as Amazulu say, sawubona. You see a person, not like recognition, but similar to that. Distinction, too, as part of that movement towards the other and towards the self, with John Coltrane distinguishing himself from the uber influence of Miles Davis. But also this acknowledgement and distinction working towards and beyond and from and nurtured by jazz history as such that even though A Love Supreme was this huge insertion of newness in jazz discourse, it was still indebted to the blues. It was still indebted to the church, to soul, to hard bop, etc. But the reason for my preamble is my trying to orientate myself in your talk, because that's the danger of interdisciplinarity. So I'm not rambling gratuitously. It's that you speak about how the concept, you talk about the concept, the social thinking, and the art. There seems to be this like lateral jump where the art does not speak to its pastness as art in reference to previous artists. It moves sideways to the concept or moves sideways to the thinkers. Is there not an argument that previous arts or previous artists always already embedded or have already embedded some of those concepts and some of those thoughts? Because my worry is that, it's not a worry because it happens. My worry is that when we don't acknowledge, when we don't do what Coltrane does and speak to Parker and speak to whatever previous, then the concepts can end up drowning out the art in music in any case, such that we always have to create our identity through the discursive other. And is there no space for the historicity of the artwork to be part of the threading of the stories that we're telling, such that it can also jump and influence the movements of the concepts as such? Ingabi ngathi is about one way, where the threading is always coming and influencing the art from the outside. That the pathways to these things preserve their multidirectionality. Thank you so much about what you're saying about acknowledgement and distinction. Thank you.
Jazz is like the perfect metaphor for the universal and the particular. And because what jazz does is it goes back to not just immediate influences, but further back. So in a way, it kind of helps elucidate what I'm trying to say, because I'm trying to argue that there are universal legacies that have been in place before colonization, that even in our schooling systems have been teaching us that that's not the case, that certain schools of thought or certain ways of thinking have a particular date or a particular context coming from a particular ontology. I mean, I think if I followed your question properly, is that what jazz does, if you appreciate a jazz song, you can feel like the universality and the kind of comfort of what is nurturing, what is universal, what is founded on diversity, actually. That's what kind of prompted me in a way to write this way, because I got to understand that diversity itself is it's didactic. You can learn from people who don't look like you, and actually start to feel that you know them, or you know their or you understand where they're coming from, not that you know their experiences. And this is it's a nice question, because it it she displays an understanding that there really is a perennial narrative, that art, most forms of art, like uh, they acknowledge and recognize and want to uh, purport that, yeah, there's a perennial narrative here.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And also, I'm not sure if I have a question, but I have thoughts, maybe ramblings. There's so much you've given us actually to think with and to think about. And you started out with colonial history and how you come into the book, and pre-colonial history. And now I find myself, really, I struggle with those terms and thinking about them, particularly with, I work with queer theory, and I think about the idea of the queer subject and the ways in which it features or doesn't feature in the kinds of pre-colonial or ideas of what this continent was or is. And so I really appreciated you kind of leading us into a bit of troubling of all of that. And I also really appreciated your art as I don't know if this is what you were saying, but you were talking about the universal conversation, a conversation that leads into the broader, a broader kind of conversation. And I mean, you were talking about the township here, and I was thinking about how particularly Johannesburg has had, there is a kind of, sort of fire time kind of history, right, that we can think about, less so here in Cape Town. And I think there's something interesting here about what you were doing in terms of, the ways in which township lives are never seen as a kind of cosmopolitan or the desire of the cosmopolitan. So it made me think of my aunts actually, who live in Soweto, and the stories they tell about apartheid Johannesburg or apartheid South Africa, and their refusal and their kind of real serious desire for a kind of cosmopolitan existence in those spaces. And so I really like where you were going with that. And then also you had this, I suppose it harkens back to, Primesh always talks about how we don't ever, we really need to think about what apartheid was. And you had a throwaway sentence there where you said, the post-apartheid struggle. And there's something interesting in that phrasing, right? Because we often speak about apartheid struggle, right? And so that's kind of, I think it was kind of a throwaway idea, but there's really something actually there about the idea of the post-apartheid struggle. I'll leave my ramblings
You
there.
see, people listen carefully, my friend.
It goes back to the idea, the hysteridence, where there's a kind of a contradiction that plays out as an ethic in South Africa, where people are still experiencing the same social, psychological issues, and it's almost as if we were still in apartheid. It was still experiencing like oppression. Like, I'll give you an example. You know, when you apply for grants and like from the government, there's this term they use, previously disadvantaged. That if you were now, this term is crazy, because what it means during apartheid, people were judged according to higher standards. Even if you're from the township, you're judged according to the same standards as someone from Oxford, you know. And then in the post-apartheid context, then it just means that since you're previously disadvantaged, you're not as economically advantaged disadvantaged story as you were during apartheid. You know, it's all this kind of social unfoldings that are continuing post apartheid, but they are subtle. You know, they're also like, because they are purported as to come from the structure, we have to accept them, and we have to accept that these are kind of a universal idea that puts everyone on the same even like yeah kiln, yeah, is that the word? Yeah. So yeah, now yeah, your question or your comment, the statement is really, yeah, elucidating very much what my idea and my work is talking about. Yeah.
I guess I was kind of really interested for you to talk a little bit more about the journey of getting published. There's so many of us here in the room who are aspiring, and the process can be quite mystical. And so I'm kind of curious how you approach that journey and what are your reflections after having been successful with it. Thank you.
In 2014, I just started writing, and I wanted to write. I'm gonna write. I'm gonna write. And I started writing about visual art. Write what you like. You know, and I started writing about visual art, and I just, yeah, I was just taking my chances, Googling places and publishing companies. It's just, yeah, this one responded. It just, there's just nothing mysterious about it. This the lack of the draw. Yeah. Hopefully, I mean, I was hope when I think about it, I think about it as like cosmic luck. But then that just make it mysterious when it was just I sent an email and the people responded, just like when you send an email, they respond with a rejection, and it's just, I think the concept of my book and how I executed it, it fit what the publishing company's research project because they mostly published nonfiction, and my book is in the category of the visual art. There's only like 144 authors that they published in the visual art department there. So yeah, I sent it in 2016, late 2016, and then it came out in February 2017. That was quite good.
It's worth noting, I think Candace's point is really interesting because you see there's a way in which what you're putting together is a constellation, and that I'm using that term very deliberately, it's a Benjaminian concept, is not necessarily always it never always finds its foothold in the publishing arena. So if you think about it, you know, the fact that they put it into art history. So I'm always interested, you see, because many years ago, John Henderson Soga wrote a book in isiXhosa called The Southeastern Bantu. He wrote it in isiXhosa. And then he went to Wits to have it published. And they said, no, he went to Lovedale, and they said they're not publishing it because the orthography of isiXhosa had changed. They had changed the way the clicks were registered, you see, in 1928. So they rejected the book, Lovedale did. So he went to Wits, and he asked Wits if they would publish it. And they said they would publish a translation. So he translated the entire 400 pages himself, right? The Xhosa version went missing. It got lost. To this day, it's lost, right? And the fascinating thing about it, it got published under the category Bantu Studies. So the book that had its ambition to make a claim on the stage of world history became a book of Eastern Cape Bantustanization. Do you see what I'm saying? And it's a radical text. Even in its English translation, he held to the principle that he was making an argument about how the Eastern Cape was dragged by the scruff of the collar into the world economy so that it could never retreat from the thought of the world, even when it was struggling locally. It's a brilliant, brilliant argument by Henderson. It's Tio Soga's son. So the question here is like where these books get placed, you know? And I'm very interested in where a question of the aesthetic and race and the politics against apartheid and so on gets placed within this classificatory system and the kind of categorizations that are available through the publishing industry. So it is interesting. When I saw your book, I thought, wow, this is a unique publication in a sense that, it would struggle in a university press, partly because of the classificatory systems that operate that's basically guard against certain kinds of questions intruding in the space of art and art history.
It's Venom Press. Yeah, it's based in America.
Yeah, I can see tomorrow that Vernon Press is going to get 2,000 emails.
Hopefully, some sales.
You can write the recommendation for everyone. So if anyone needs a letter of recommendation, you can see Themba afterwards.
I'm on X a lot. Yeah.
There's a student confession for you.
Yeah, Elon Musk is and there's a lot of chat around framing regression as a form of reverse racism. So when you spoke about acknowledgement and distinction, I thought of cooperation, tolerance. So my question is, how do you push for distinction, acknowledgement, while also trying to evade accusations of reverse racism or alienation?
This word distinction is not. I don't want to use it in a aggressive way. Yes, it's to understand difference, but then difference is universal. That's what I'm kind of trying to to argue and push with this concept, that difference is not a point of aggressive division, but it's just that the ambiguity of being separated as humans actually unites us, connects us. It could be from a political stance someone has. It could be yes, their nationality. It's just that we live in a culture where division is practical, and so we was socialized in a way that when we see someone as distinct from us, we think of them as distant, or we cannot learn anything from them, or you, especially coming from an African background, as myself, I have nothing constructive to contribute to the society except be like a manual labor, So in those terms, in that frame of mind, is why I'm trying to utilize the term in my work, in those.
You should hang out with Moritz van Beverdenker, because you two of you are pretty much in the same ballpark. Not so, Moritz?
No, Themba, thank you. And I agree with what you're saying largely. I think what's interesting is this: we have this formulation in the center for describing some of the work that we do. So it's what we share but not in common, right? Which resonates in very interesting ways with what you're talking about difference as something that's universal, right? I mean, if we could pass this through psychoanalysis and talk about the internal division of the subject, right? So all of us are already several, but then also just the idea of how do you deal with difference as something that you acknowledge without reifying. And that's what I think you're getting at with your idea of acknowledgement and distinction. So I just had one question in relation to that, and maybe this is a complicated question, I don't know. But because when you started your overview of your work, you were talking about that, as Lwando was saying, the distinction between the pre-colonial and the colonial and the post-colonial, and that these are spoken of as though they are unrelated discourses, right? There's a separation. There's which you might call a distinction between them, right? And so I was wondering, in your thinking, where you go at the difference between distinction and separation, right? And the way that distinction, if you think of, say, like a school system or the university, is a way of marking hierarchy, right? This person's graduating with distinction, but that one not so much. Yeah. So, yeah, I just thought maybe if you could play with that a little bit.
I mean, I think your question kind of, I think it is kind of geared towards the idea of like infinite referral, where the idea of difference in Derrida's thinking. So I mean, how concepts become distributed throughout history. The idea of separation, what it does, it creates a kind of a hard line or an inseparable wall between how ideas have evolved and how they are functioning in contemporary context. So I mean that's kind of what pushed me also to this idea of hysteridence, that instead of thinking of separation, we think of infinite referral. Yeah, ideas become metaphoric, like in a psychoanalysis sense, through accretion and what's the word now? Yeah, but through how they function with how they're accrued through history, and that's how I started thinking about in terms of distinction. Uh, Even if an idea has evolved from the past, it still maintains its uniqueness. No, it's not particularly about separate, or it doesn't function separately from how it was concretized in history. So that, yeah, I think I answered it.
Yeah. No, I mean it's a. If you think about if Gugulective was the impulse that gets us to think the post-apartheid differently, it would lead to a massive shake-up of all these art schools that teach the kind of normative historicist form of the emergence of an art tradition, right? And that's why I always thought the Gugulective was doing more than we could ever accept as the society at that time. I mean, because what he was doing was creating a different philosophical reckoning with the problem which it was inhabiting and which it wanted to exit, in a sense, right? So that first installation in the shack behind the, the everything was on the roof.
Okay, yeah.
What was it called?
Wait, the reference was as if the shack was
Yeah.
a bus
Yeah,
that's
that's
moving
right.
through the Eastern
Yeah.
Cape. Yeah, that's, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
I mean, remarkable, because all the sign systems there were just overturned in the way you think about art history. And I remember Unati in particular being completely enthralled with what you could do with the art object in that state. But so it does seem to me, that we have been tussling for a long time on what an aesthetic education might be. And in a university, it becomes a little more difficult to make that argument, particularly at a place like UWC. But it is interesting that we would not think that in constituting an epistemological project in humanities or whatever the case might be, to take our inaugural point from a project like the Gugulective, because what it would do is reorient completely how you think about the assemblages that you're going to be working with. So I just want to say, there's something about the failure, and I use that word kind of cautiously, of producing a post-apartheid, a concept of the post-apartheid that would become both meaningful for us to proceed, but also a concept that is livable. Because at the moment, what you find is a concept of the post-apartheid, if it even exists or even gets enunciated, that is about permanent war. And what it is, it's a permanent war of those very constituencies that fought apartheid. It's the scapegoating problem that you find again and again. I'm watching the stuff unfold, in the intensities now. And I'm wondering whether this aesthetic education does, and what you are offering us, does something quite different to how we proceed here.
I'm glad, you recognize that that my idea articulates a kind of ideological expression that is not just contradicting contemporary context, but also historic context where they were formulated. I mean, part of the reason why intellectual legacies from quote unquote poor communities become erased is because they, in a way, they have to speak to that ideology, how it's a didactic facility, how it's universal, like for example. And what the media does is that it it portrays the people that produce those intellectual legacies as like historic accidents. You know, that's why we as Gugulective, we wanted to work as a group first, because we didn't want to be a generation that experiences that. You know, okay, we realize that people have also like their individual projects and their personal researches, but we didn't want to be a, a group of artists, writers, and painters, and that again are going to be erased by a narrative that we try to universalize.
Or even worse, become a subject of a dissertation that no one wants to, that no one actually is interested in reading. Because, you know, I know you had guys, suddenly you were like the major thing. The sexiest thing in town was the Gugulective, and everyone wanted to write a dissertation without engaging the question that was being posed by the Gugulective at the house. So that's the point, you know, that unless one develops a vocabulary around this work, you will be the signifier that never reaches the destination in the signified. And there's a lesson in this, you see, because in Gayatri Spivak's formulation of the subaltern, it is the subject that never comes into being. It always fails to make its cut, make its mark, and so on. So I want to end my kind of provocation here by saying that I think the work of the Gugulective is not over. That in fact it might have begun something that we are only now beginning to realize the import of. And I want to, you know, just say thank you for the opportunity to kind of think with you about what that might be. I mean, we are on the edges of that conversation, and we are far behind in relation to the kind of grand heights of aesthetic theory and aesthetic thinking in this country. But I think the perspective that we offer and bring to this question, this opportunity of learning to learn from below, I think is going to become a crucial feature of thinking the post-apartheid. I think it's being ignored at the peril of the society, and I think, you know, we are short of ideas in this country and imagination because we refuse to to engage in a process of learning to learn. So Themba, I mean, I want to just say thank you really for this wonderful opportunity. It's great to, you know, it's always great to see a former student, you know, putting forward ideas, taking forward ideas. So we look forward to the next book. Maybe you want to help others to get to Vernon Press and, you know, guide them along the way. I think they, but please, you know, join me in thanking Themba.